Hello and welcome to this week's episode of That Real Estate Tech Guy. I'm your host, Jordan Samuel Fleming, and today my guest was Zachary Beach from Smarter Real Estate. Now, this is actually kind of a repeat performance because I had Chris Prefontaine on a couple episodes ago, who's a business partner of Zachary's and his father-in-law, as I found out. But I was really excited to have Zachary on to dive into some bits we didn't dive in with Chris. And Zachary's got a really, really interesting backstory from kind of bartender to real estate investor to now the CEO of a coaching and community company. And we really got to dive into that journey from how he got into real estate, how he could figure out that he could do it, how he could scale it up. And we really did focus in on what it was like to go from that one first deal to realization to scale. And that's a journey that I think that chimes with a lot of real estate investors. Zachary's clearly got a very, very, he's got a very clever approach to this. He's very switched on. He knows exactly how he wants to do these things. And it's very intentional in all this. And what that means is he's, you get a real good sense of exactly what his journey was, where the hard parts were, and the lessons he's learned. And so I think that's a great, great episode for that reason. So let's dive right in with me and a conversation with Zachary Beach. And I'm live with Zachary Beach. Zachary, welcome to the podcast. Give us a little introduction to you and your background.
Sure, Jordan, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. A little bit about me. I'm Zach Beach, CEO of Smart Real Estate Coach. But 12 years ago, I was a bartender, personal trainer. Really, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I came out of college. The only reason why I went to college was because my teacher said I couldn't. Maybe you guys can relate to that. So when I graduated, I really honestly didn't know what I wanted to do. So I did what any good college student does that has a marketing degree, as he becomes a bartender. So I jumped into bartending, and really when I started that, I told now my wife and was my girlfriend for a very long time. I said, look, if we get into bartending, I only want to do it for about 4 years. I'm giving myself that timeline. I was about 21 when we did it. And it was starting to get around like that 3-year mark that I started to say, well, look, we got to start looking at some additional options. So I actually approached my girlfriend at the time, and then fiance, and then wife, father, Chris Prefontaine, which I know you've had on this podcast before. And I said, hey, I don't know if I'm going to like real estate, but it's going to be a heck of a lot better than what I'm doing here right now. So what I did was I did what most people do is, I started taking on like a quote unquote side hustle. I was like, all right, let's try this real estate thing. So I jumped in, I started making phone calls, and really from there, I was able to accomplish my first real estate transaction within a relatively short period of time. And at that point in time, I was hooked. And I said to Chris, and I said to my wife, and I said, look, it's time we make a transition. I think we burn the ships at this point in time. So we went ahead. I actually stopped bartending, and I actually personal trained on the side as well. So I actually stopped doing that and jumped right into real estate full time about 11 and a half, 12 years ago. And kind of history has been made from there, as I've been a full-time investor for almost about 12 years now.
That's fantastic. So let's dive into that. Let's unpack that a little, because that's there's a couple parts of that story that's really interesting, that's probably going to resonate with people. And partly as the, like, to explore a bit more about that jump, because it is a jump, and partly the kind of, I guess, the transition from side hustle to full hustle, that kind of journey. And let's start, if you don't mind. I wouldn't mind starting with the bartending gig, actually.
Sure.
Because of course you said when I started out, I hopped on the phones. Now,
Yeah.
most people are terrified about hopping on the phones. That's and I run a phone system, so right, like I get that. But bartenders tend to have to be pretty sociable and
Sure.
speak to people if they're good bartenders.
Yeah.
So do you feel like the jump into calling was eased because of that kind of the social element of both personal training, where you're coaching someone and motivating them, and bartending? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Interesting enough, the bartender that I became really close with ended up getting into being a real estate agent. And I went on the real estate investment side, which was actually interesting that you bring that up. I think that when you look at a bartender, yes, there's some skills that you learn while being a bartender, especially if you're going to be a good one, as you mentioned. But there's also a comfort level of being behind the pine, right? Like you have a foot and a half between you and somebody else. And I never calculate the actual length of a bar, but I'm guessing around a foot and a half. And there's also some liquid courage that comes involved too, right? Because if the bartender that I was entertaining like bachelorette parties, and I lived in and worked in like a very destination, like summer destination place. It's Newport, Rhode Island. Beautiful place. But you're there to entertain in that factor. So yes, I think there were some skills that I developed when it came to entertaining people and being able to kind of think on my toes, because I had to have lots and lots of very short conversation with people. But to encourage the people that weren't bartenders, I also had to learn a heck of a lot of skills of being on the phone. And I was just as afraid as everybody else. It wasn't like I was, remiss to not know what was at stake when I was on the phone with people. So I had to learn a lot of more skill sets and communication, of clear communication when you're on the phone, because there's a lot of things that you can make up for when you're behind the bar, including giving somebody an extra shot to make sure that they're additionally happy, right? So when it came with actually communicating on the phone, there's a lot of skills that I had to learn. But yes, I would agree that I did have some practice of being kind of in front of people, which allowed me to make that type of transaction maybe a little bit easier than most.
I think I'm going to date myself here, but as you were talking about that, it made me think about the movie Cocktail that starred Tom Cruise back in the day, which probably dates me a little, because that's got to be a 30-year-old movie at this point.
At least, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, people always bring that up to me, especially the older crowd. I was like, so you kind of like cocktails. I was like, yeah, but like much better. Like, just imagine, but I was better. They just didn't have a movie around me.
That's funny, and it does date me a little. Now, okay, so let's go into the skills, because you're absolutely right. The transition from what you were doing in real estate and hopping on the phone. Most people get nervous about making phone calls. 100% they get nervous. And your point is really interesting as well. In person, you have visual cues. And visual cues, visual communication, how we react to the way people's body language is and facial expressions and all that. That's a huge part of communication, that we rely on, that you get removed the moment you hop on a phone. So how did you go about, what was the process like? What was the journey like getting comfortable on the phone? Did you do any specific training? Can you walk me through what that kind of transition was like?
I love that you bring this up, because I've actually never been asked these questions in this order. So this is interesting, because I honestly believe that bartending helped me more with like translating to like a meetup or to like a in-person networking group, because that is more like bartending, where you're constantly communicating with people on a short schedule of trying to get a feel of who they are and what's happening in their lives, and be able to then eventually translate that to a longer term relationship. Versus the phone. Yeah, the phone's a different animal, because the only way that you can really tell what is going on in somebody's life is if you actually leave a voicemail for them, and then you have them call you back, and you listen to their voicemail when they call you back. So now you're like, okay, I got a good understanding of the tonality, what the person's attitude is like. But we don't always get that ability, and it shortens, or I should say lengthens, the amount of time that we get to a deal for constantly playing phone tag, trying to understand their tonality. So really the phone for me was like that 10,000 hour skill. It was getting on the phone and having repetition after repetition after repetition after repetition, and being able to manage the key rebuttals that you have to really put together. So when I look at a phone call, there's really like three segments of that phone call, at least in our space. There's like the introduction, right? And we have to be very particular in the introduction, because we have to automatically, stop that person in their tracks a bit, make sure they know exactly who we are, why we're calling, and getting permission. We all like intro, clarification, then permission. So we first introduce who we are, because we never want someone later on to be like, wait, who are you again and why are you calling? We need to be able to tell them exactly who we are. We need to get clarification that we're talking to the right person about that property. Because how often have we then got into a phone call 10, 15 minutes later and we're like talking to the grandson of the person that makes a decision? So ask me how I know, right? And then we need to get permission, which is probably the most important thing. We need to get permission that we can ask them specific questions about them and their property. Because especially when you're doing creative financing deals, and again, I'm just kind of going based on like my relation of real estate investing for over a decade now, we need to ask some personal questions to somebody that we might not know that well. And we need to be able to build rapport and enough trust in a very short period of time. And this is really where the skill set of making phone calls really comes into play. Like, you start to get deals more quickly because you're able to authentically build trust in a short period of time and get the information needed from that particular person. So that way you can make a decision and you're not spending tens of thousands of hours with people that aren't going to actually make a deal. Because that's another key component as you build a business here. So once we dive in past that, once we get permission, then we have a key set of questions we need to ask to determine motivation. Now, motivation for us could be positive or negative, right? So we have lots of people that we buy properties from that they want the best price. Well, that's not really a negative motivation. They're just looking for something better than what the market is currently giving them. Then when you have like the, quote unquote negative motivation where somebody's like behind on payments or they need debt relief or, they're in a financial bind, we need to be able to identify that. And then once we've identified motivation, now we jump into like the actual financials of the property. And that's really key for our investment strategies because we got to understand which one of our strategies are going to come into play based upon the current financials of the property. And that's really where our like 3-step process of making these phone calls, because then from there, we're going to educate people. We always like to tell people we're just as much in the education business as we are the investment business, because now we need to educate people on the new strategies or the new concepts that they're hearing so then we can start moving them closer towards their deals. Now, I don't know if I hit on every component that you're looking for when it came to these phone calls, but maybe if there's anything I missed, let me know.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt this amazing conversation, but I wanted to make sure you knew that Smartphone, the only phone system built for real estate investors, connects to the best-in-class real estate investing CRMs. And because, as it's my show and I am co-founder and chairman of Smartphone, I got some great deals for you. Click the link, take advantage of 5,000 minutes free calling with Smartphone, the only phone system built for real estate investors. Click and call. Close more leads. Back to the show. Well, no, what makes me smile is, it dovetails nicely, everything you just talked about, into a lot of the work I've been doing recently inside of Smartphone, where we are releasing an entire recruitment center of AI voice agents. And people it's an immediately polarizing topic, because some people think that's fucking amazing, and some people just are like, are you kidding? This is the worst thing that's ever happened, and they'll never be able to do the job properly, etc. But the training that we've been putting these agents through very much mirrors the training that you're describing, and the outcomes that you get from these agents are actually very powerful and very aligned with what we want as outcomes from humans. They just function on a 24-hour basis without the need to pee. But it's a fascinating, when you start to understand and break down the structure of a conversation. I love the idea of the permission element, particularly, the being able to draw enough of a relationship where you can get people to open up to the real motivations. Because a lot of times what I've found is that people will guard motivation. So some people, not everybody.
Yeah.
Some people scream motivation from the rooftop because they're either acutely hurting or or because that's who they are. But there are lots of people who guard motivation, right?
For sure.
And so you need to be able to build that trust and permission, to use your language, to be able to get them to bring you the real motivation. Um, and I think that's a fascinating, when you start to break down what conversations really are, whether you're teaching a person, you're teaching an AI agent, those principles kind of remain true the whole time. I don't know if you've had any experience with the AI side, but I've certain you've trained people with the way you're speaking about it.
Oh, for sure. We've trained hundreds of thousands of people.
Thousands.
Because that is the first skill within our genius model that you really need to nail down. It's mindset, skill set, systems, and communication with sellers is the beginning, because every business needs lead generation and needs it consistently if you want to create a predictable business long term. And like a side note on the AI, I would love. I'm the type of person that says, yeah, let's get AI to do those phone calls, because if we can train virtual assistants all across the country to be able to gather that type of information without the background and the knowledge and the internet and all of that, right, that's associatedly tied to AI, then I believe we can get that done as well, for sure. And I would love that, because then real estate investors can up level and focus on money producing activities, which means they're way more likely to be able to leave their W-2 job or build that side income that they wanted, or be able to go on those vacations that they want, because they're spending that 5-10 hours a week on money producing activities. The only thing that I would have some pushback on is a lot of the investors today are learning that skill set at a very low barrier, right? To like have lots and lots of phone calls. That way they can up level their skills. So there would be some foundational training that would need to be nailed down. But I love that when you're talking about AI there and generating that long-term success by being able to make it automated, which I absolutely love that. So keep pushing that thing forward, for sure.
Automated. And it's funny, I was having a meeting with a guy the other day who has a CRM system he built, and he's one of our partners, and he's building a set of AI agents with us right now for his community, because he's got a coaching platform. And so we spent a few minutes I was setting him up with a demo of our acquisitions agent. Because, of course, just like people, what people don't understand is, just like people, agents need to be trained for roles. And the specificity of training means they produce. And he, in front of me, he's like, I'm going to call her right now. And, part of me, it was going, oh, shit, live demos are always a nightmare of that. And he was having a conversation with our agent, and he was talking about this property, and the agent was able to have a full conversation about the probate process and ask intelligent questions about it, not which was a natural part of the conversation. And that's what and that's where that technology is at this point. It's something we can follow up on if you're interested, certainly after the show. But no, if we go dive back into your real estate journey, I know now. I obviously know, and I talked to Chris, and it was a joy. It was great fun speaking to Chris. He has a very direct mannerism of
very Massachusetts and New England.
He couldn't be more New Massachusetts. Like if you were gonna go to Central Casting,
yeah,
you might just say, "See Chris." But I really enjoyed the conversation. But I want to dive into your into the before we go into the smarter real estate. Let's go into the the experience of getting the deals going. You got your first deal relatively quickly. You were hitting the phones. What was that journey of going from, hey, I think this is, you said sort of like, we got to put our chips in on this and go. What was your personal journey of moving into it, doing it full time, and realizing this is now something I can do as an investor?
Yeah, and this might tie back into, some of the conversation I was saying earlier, right? Is I know we kind of jumped in when we went into the AI, and that was really when the communication and when we were able to start really driving leads and then eventually driving a significant business when it came to real estate investing, it was a mindset shift that really hit me after I got my first deal. And I think that's what hits most investors, especially either brand new investors, right, that are trying to make this similar jump. Now, I was lucky enough to do it at 24, right, versus some people are doing it in their 40s and 50s and 60s because, they spent longer time in pursuing a different career. But it's a mindset shift. And a piece I wanted to hit on earlier was the moment in time when I was confident enough and really clear enough that I could help people was the moment that I started asking hard questions. Because yes, we need to build rapport on the phone, but we also need to be able to ask people very specific questions that can give us the answers so we can determine whether a good fit or not, right? And the faster that you can really make that decisive decision is the more quickly you can get off the phone or put them in your follow-up system and then go back to spending time with the next people. So after I got that first deal, I started realizing like, oh, I can truly help people here, right? Or, I can actually do this, knowing that I was a complete novice at the time as well, right? Because one deal does not make me a real estate investor. But I knew at the time, I was like, oh, this is something I could be successful at. And outside of like playing football and sports, I didn't find that in school. I didn't find that in college. And honestly, I found that maybe a little bit in bartending because I knew I could entertain people and I was able to kind of move up in the, the bartending ladder of those couple areas because I could, I was good with people at the time. But I found at that point in time, I was like, okay, this is something that like if I pour into, and I know, like, from looking at all the research out there, right, the most successful, most wealthy people are investing in real estate or businesses like M&A. Like, that those are the places. So I knew I could change my stars, per se, if you are familiar with the movie The Knight's Tale, right? I was looking to change my stars from being somebody that grew up with a single mother, right, and no real big financial backing. She was a cashier at Lowe's. Like, I wanted to change the trajectory of my life. So I think right at that moment, I said, all right, this is something that we can do. And that's when I made that decision of like, I could go all in. I wasn't all in up until I was able to see a check. And the check wasn't huge either. But the first deal, it was a little bit complex. It was known as a subject to deal, which basically means that you buy the property and the title transfers over to your company, but you leave the current debt that the seller already has in place. You just make the payment on their behalf, which for most people feels like a little bit of a complex deal. But once I nailed it down, I was like, okay, if this is going to be one of the more quote unquote challenging deals that I do, then the rest of the strategies that I'm doing, like seller financing and lease options, I'm like, oh, this is going to be a drop in the bucket. Well, don't get me wrong. I had lots and lots and lots of learning lessons moving forward. But I knew at that point in time I could do this. And that's where my mindset changed. And that's when I started to go all in. And I said, okay, how do I now develop these skills? How do I now develop my mindset so I can start attacking this from an entrepreneurial stage now? Because I went from somebody else is paying a check if I showed up, right? To now I need to deliver on results. And I tell this a lot to our community members, which is you used to get paid for hours. Now you're getting paid on results. So now I need to switch my mindset and I need to say, okay, how can I do not just one of these, say every couple months, but how do I do this like now monthly? And then we started fine tuning and I'd say, okay, well, how do we do this a couple times a month? And then we fine tune this. And then this is where the scaling of our business started to come in place because we went from Chris, my business partner, was doing a lot of the closing to then I started taking over the lead generation side, to then I started taking over the entire seller side, to then we started moving my brother-in-law who's helping me with lead gen, then to just the buyer side. And that's when the team evolved. And that's when we started to scale. And that's at that point in time, I started to see a clear vision. And then that's when we really doubled down and we started doing, say, 4 to 10 deals a month because we started looking at this business as a viable, scalable business, not just a lifestyle business.
Absolutely. And now you mentioned a couple things in that that I want to follow up on. Number one, I want to follow up on the scaling element. And two, you also mentioned back when you were talking about doing the hard conversations, asking the hard questions, you were talking about being able to get off, relatively quickly and get them into a follow-up. Now, yep. The follow-up is where most investors suck at, fail, and in my view, at least, the follow-up is everybody wants the shiny. Everyone wants the new. Nobody wants the grind of the follow-up, but the follow-up's where you make all the money. So as you started to build this first, obviously now where you have a community that you're teaching this, you have methodologies, and they're worked out. But you had to discover that, or you had to build that. And I mean, I've got a company with 60 people in it, and I understand how it is, what was involved with scaling. For you, and when you were kind of coming to the scaling realization in your real estate point, what were some of the key things that you had to do that helped you scale, that were able to, whether it's follow up or consistency or structure or whatever? What would you say some of the key learnings you made as you moved from, oh, I can do this, to, oh, I'm scaling something?
Yeah. No particular order. Awesome question. So first and foremost, the ability to duplicate and transition from one person that has all the knowledge to now value being added from others. And some of these if you're listening to this, some of these may sound novice, right? But the truth is, each and every one of these is $1 billion company to a $1,000 company, right? So being able to add that value. So the first thing that we need to do was pull out all the information from Chris's brain and then be able to translate it equally into my brain, especially on the lead generation to seller side, because that's where I started to feel natural and really knew I could produce. And then we need to do the same thing on the buyer side to Nick Prefontaine, which is my brother-in-law, and he handled all the buyer side. So we really need to suck all the information and then be able to add value. And now we're adding value as a team, not just as an individual and a bunch of people doing tasks. So that was the first thing. Then I think what I added to come to the table is I had a new set of eyes. And then I said, all right, my brain works in systems in a way as well. So then I need to develop some systems associated with this. Because we went from, let's say paper and pen, right? People's names, numbers, paper and pen. So anytime we needed new information, we had to literally pull out a folder and write down the information. So, there was a lot of technology and CRMs coming out around, say, 10 years ago. So we needed to develop a system first and foremost. So we eventually created what's known as our 7 steps to a taken. And a taken for us is a property under agreement. So we developed this okay, all we need to do is move this person from this step to this step to this step to this step, which creates redundancy, right? But also creates an easier way to follow up. Because then we just go and we go, how many people are in bucket 5? Do we need to touch bases? How many people are in bucket 4? Okay, so then we had that. And we were actually doing that through a 1 through 31 folder. And I don't know if you guys know what that is, but basically it is a folder that translates to, number 1 is, January 1st, and that's January 31st. And it didn't matter on the month. It just was every day I went in the office, I would go look at what the date is and I'd pull out the folder, and that's my follow-up system. Right? So then I would just be on the phone with someone. They'd be like, oh, follow up me in 3 days. So I just moved that piece of paper to there. And that worked for a little bit, right? And that works to maybe a deal a month where you're okay, yep, I have this, but things get missed, right? And that's why I think a lot of people struggle with follow-up, is because they just don't have a system to remind them to follow up with people. Because if everybody actually true believed that saying, right, that the fortune's in the follow-up, and it is absolutely true, that everybody would spend all that time, because literally the hardest step is the first step. It's actually acquiring the new lead that's the hardest. It's not the follow-up of that new lead, but we all forget. We also are trained too to say, I want the next lead, the next lead, the next lead, instead of being I want, the next deal. So that's a mindset transition that happens over time as well, because you always want to be closer, right? You always want to spend the most amount of time closest to the deal, which is later on down the line follow up. And that also comes with, how do I duplicate myself and put people furthest away from the deal? That's where the scaling component comes into play. That's where your virtual assistants and your new hires. Okay, so once we had that, then this is perfect for this podcast. Now we need to develop or utilize some technology around this. So that way it's not just in my folder, but if I'm out of the office, somebody else can follow up or be notified as well. So then it got introduced to a thing called Podio back in the day, which was a very low grade CRM, but it worked. And then we got introduced to their add-on Investor Fuse, right, from there. And then we end up using Freedom Soft for a little bit as well. Rob's a great guy, Rob Swanson. And then we eventually created this really cool strategic partnership with Damon Remy and REI Black Book, which has been absolutely amazing. And we've now built out like all of our systems, not only for us, but for our community inside REI Black Book. So like, they have everything from phones to websites, so you name it. But that's really where that it went from an idea, right, to a paper system to then a technology system in CRM. That way we could actually start moving this business forward and start now translating more value to other people. And then that's when we developed, additional VAs and other people in our companies to continue to push this lead generation so we can continue to scale.
Absolutely. And that's such a, and the best bit about that is, I think, your point to, if only everybody would actually pay attention to the idea that the fortune is in the follow-up properly. One thing I have learned over having my own businesses for 20 some odd years is that business fundamentals are fundamental for a reason. And whatever shortcut you think you're taking, chances are it's not a shortcut, because the fundamentals, whether you're talking in a normal business, the fundamentals of cash flow and all that sort of thing, or you're talking from a real estate point of view, the fundamentals of a proper follow-up, they're fundamentals because they are universally true. There is no shortcut to it. And it frustrates me, and it must frustrate you as someone who trains people a lot in your community, when you see people skipping out on that fundamental truth of the follow-up. So I do think that's a really important point you made.
Well, and thank you for that, Jordan. It's really a transition in mindset, right? As I mentioned, what I had to go through was I needed to show up at a bar. I knew I was going to get paid a certain amount based on the night, but I could maybe affect it by really holding people there by making an extra $100 or $200 or something like that, right? Two, I needed to deliver results. So over the course of my investment career, I continue to look for, and we continue to look for, the ability to fine tune so that way your skill set is put where you can deliver the most results. And everything else can and eventually should be either automated or delegated to somebody else. Because you can't take 10 years or 12 years of real estate experience and then just automatically dump it on the new hire. We need to train the new hire with the fundamental skills, as you brought up, to eventually elevate them over time. The analogy is great, like the doctor's office analogy, right? You only see the doctor for 15 minutes at the most. And that means you probably have a bad doctor's visit, right? Up until then, you walk in, you get greeted by the person at the receptionist, and then the receptionist hands you over to the nurse, and then the nurse hands you over to maybe the person larding underneath the doctor, and then your doctor comes in for 15 minutes at the most, and then you get handed back off to somebody else. So if you think about that in your business, how do you then have a VA then bring the lead? And then you have what we would call maybe a seller specialist, somebody that just works with sellers, then eventually bring that lead to a certain point, and then you get to structure the deal or close the deal. Right? And that's the fun part of being an investor. Eventually you just get closer and closer to the money producing activity. And that's really where the mindset eventually continues to shift, because then you just learn to delegate and automate everything, or as much as possible, to eventually grow and reach that level of deals that you want to be at.
Absolutely. I think that's fantastic. And I think that is a great message to end on. Before we close out, though, Zachary, I do want to give you a chance to sort of, let people know how they can get in touch with you, how they can find out more about how you're training and the amazing stuff you've built with Chris and your team there. Let people know how can they get in touch with you and find out and learn from you.
I appreciate that, Jordan. If you're listening to this, I want to give you our Amazon best-selling book, because we just barely scratched the surface. We actually went deep into like the actual skill set and systems associated with our business. But if you want to learn how to buy real estate without cash, credit, or banks, and be able to tap into our 3-paydays system, we actually create 3 income streams on every single deal. I want to give you a free book. You don't have to go on Amazon and buy it for $18, $25. I want to ship it to you for free. All you have to do is go to three-paydaysbooks.com, three-paydaysbooks.com. You could grab it. It's called Real Estate on Your Terms. I co-authored it along with Chris Prefontaine and Nick Prefontaine. It really dives into all of our models, all of our strategies. So you can either bolt that onto your current business, or we can utilize this to help you retire from your W-2 job.
Fantastic. And you know what? Because I think I've been talking to Chris about maybe coming on and doing one of the master classes inside of our community. What I'll do is I'm going to make sure that the link to that book gets embedded in our, in a way that can be much more, visible to the community, because it's a great offer. It's a great opportunity for people to take advantage of it. So I'll figure out a way in advance of being able to get Chris on, and to coincide with you coming on the podcast, with how to get that book out to our entire audience in a little more direct way.
All right, I appreciate that. Very grateful for you, Jordan. Thank you.
Well, listen, Zachary, it's been an absolute pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to listen to the story, and thank you for coming on. Thank you for giving such great value to the audience, and I'm looking forward to being able to catch up with you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another amazing episode of That Real Estate Tech Guy. Head over to thatrealestatetechguy.com to check out all episodes and get special discounts on tons of awesome real estate technology platforms.